Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today. Looks like we have a very diverse crowd from all over the country, so we're excited to have you with us. As Rose said, my name is Victoria, and I work for Population Connection Action Fund, and I will be moderating Brian's conversation today. So we are here with Brian Dixon. Brian is the Senior Vice President for Media and Government Affairs at Population Connection and Population Connection Action Fund. So before we start, I just want to go through a few housekeeping items. First, everyone has been automatically muted. If everyone could please stay muted throughout the call to make sure that everyone could hear Brian, that'd be great. Second, please feel free to use the chat box to ask any questions you have during the presentation. I will read some of the questions aloud for Brian during the Q&A at the end. And third, we have already received a lot of great questions, and I'm sure we'll have some more. So unfortunately, we might not be able to answer every one of them during this presentation. However, if we don't get to your question, please feel free to send us an email at engage@popconnect.org, and we will get back to you. All right, so Brian, take it away.
Thanks, Tori and Rose, and thank you all for joining us today. It's great to see so many names I recognize and faces I can see on the screen. So I appreciate your taking the time this afternoon. I thought I would start off with the thing that sort of is top of mind for everyone these days, and that's the COVID pandemic, and especially how it's playing around the world in relation to a lot of the really bad global health and especially reproductive health policies that we've been fighting against for the last several years, especially the Global Gag Rule. So the Global Gag Rule is exacerbating the impact of the pandemic in the developing world. And the pandemic, of course, is exacerbating the impact of the Global Gag Rule around the world. It's dramatically increasing the stress on health systems, which have already been pretty significantly disrupted as a result of clinics being forced to close, shortages of supplies, a loss of adequate funding. All of this is being magnified by what's happening now. Clinics have had to lay off staff, they've had to cut back on their outreach, and the pandemic is also changing the kind of care that's being able to be delivered. It's a lot of places are being overwhelmed with virus patients and are not able to provide the reproductive health care that so many people still need. And we've been working with partners in several countries around the world. In South Africa, we've been working with a commissioner of gender equality, a doctor who goes by the name Dr. T. In fact, just earlier today, she did a Twitter chat with our communications team to talk about what's happening in South Africa and the impacts there. In Kenya, we're working with a nurse and other providers talking about what's happening in their country, and they're seeing a lot of the same things, and the same things in Latin America. And one of the things that's not really getting much attention is in several of these places, they've all brought up on their own an increase in domestic and gender-based violence cases, and the lack of ability for these women to get the care they need and to get out of violent situations. What's happening at home is not that much different. The Trump administration is proposing massive cuts to global health funding again in the midst of this pandemic. He's threatening to cut off all aid to the World Health Organization. In the budget proposal that the administration sent to Congress in February, there's a massive cut to overall global health, but more than 60% cut to family planning and reproductive health. And we all know what that's going to do. And at home, again, as I said, what's happening with COVID is much the same. Right-wing politicians, both in Washington and around the country and states, are using the pandemic to further restrict access to reproductive health. In Arkansas, for example, in order for a woman to get an abortion, she has to get a negative COVID test. But of course, there are no tests. And the only people who can get tests in many places are already symptomatic. No other procedure has this kind of restriction on it. And like what's happening in Texas and Ohio, where they're coming up with all kinds of rules simply to make these services out of reach. I'll just give an example. In Ohio, a few years ago, they passed a law requiring clinics that provide abortion to have a doctor with admitting privileges at a local hospital. That's an unreasonable rule to begin with. But then they refused any state money to any hospital that gave admitting privileges to a doctor who provided abortions at any of these clinics. So creating these catch-22s for people. Texas and other states have deemed abortion care non-essential, which seems silly since there are a few things more essential to be done in a certain amount of time than that. And the fact that pregnancy seems to increase a person's risk of experiencing severe consequences from the virus. This, in addition to the already existing efforts to close down Planned Parenthood clinics around the country and cut off and other things to reduce access to reproductive health care, especially for lower income people. All of this is sort of leading to these shortages of care for the people who need it most. Our organization a few years ago started our Fight for Her campaign, Her for Health Empowerment Rights, where we now have on-the-ground organizers in 9 places around the country, key communities. Some of these states and communities may sound familiar to those of you who follow politics, but they're in New Hampshire. We have one in New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Ohio, North Carolina, Colorado, Arizona, and in the Sacramento area of California, where we're in a district currently represented by Ami Bera, congressman who's been a great champion for these programs and is in one of California's swing districts. Historically is one of the last elections to be determined in that state. So they're on the ground out there working with candidates, working with elected officials, and working with volunteers who we've been recruiting. Last night, they had a national volunteer call with about 162 people on it. People who are ready to go, are looking to be engaged in these issues in their communities. Some of you have been to our Capitol Hill Days events in the past, and maybe some of you participated this year. We had to go from an in-person event in Washington to an all-digital event where we did, and frankly, the participation was much higher than we even expected. I think on Monday when we did the advocacy meetings and stuff, we had overall something like 1,000 people engaging by sending letters, by making phone calls, by participating in digital meetings with their representatives and senators' office, similar to what we're doing today. Congresswoman Susie Lee from Nevada joined the Zoom call with the volunteers in that district personally. Several other members of Congress tweeted out their support for the Fight for Her and for the issues we've been working on, repealing the Global Gag Rule, addressing the Helms Amendment, expanding access to global reproductive health, in making significant increases in the investments that our country's making in those programs. So that was an incredibly successful event. So we're really proud of how that went. And we just kicked off our Summer of Her program, where we've recruited close to 130 summer fellows who'll get pretty intensive training over 12 weeks in organizing around the issues, in getting skills in media and social media and advocacy, working with campaigns, which frankly is going to be pretty different this year, which I'll talk about a little bit in a little while. But that leads us to the work we have been doing with candidates. Population Connection Action Fund endorses candidates across the country for federal office. We've endorsed, I think, about a dozen candidates for the Senate this year so far, and something like 50 candidates for the House so far, and we're working with them on a pretty regular basis, talking about these issues, getting them to talk about these issues, bringing them up to speed so that when, I don't want to like to say if, but when they are elected, they get into office with a solid grounding in these and are ready to go from the first day. And we had a really successful year in 2018 where a number of the candidates we endorsed and supported did win their elections. People like Susan Wild in the Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania, who's now on the Foreign Affairs Committee and is a champion for these programs, and Abigail Spanberger from Virginia, and Xochitl Torres Small from New Mexico. Some of these represent really, really challenging districts to hold, but we're pretty committed to keeping them here because they've been really helpful in pushing back against some of the harmful policies that the administration has been promoting. And they've been really helpful in making sure that the egregious cuts to funding in these programs don't come to fruition. And I see somebody just asked a question about where you can find out who we've endorsed. They're all on the Population Connection Action Fund website. We have a page of 2020 endorsements. You can find any of them and get more information about each of these candidates. And we're continuing to work with new ones to expand our engagement with candidates, especially in some of the swing districts and states across the country, because we're not going to change the policies that we're fighting against until we change the people who've been in charge of making them. And with that, I think why don't I turn it over to questions so we can have more of a conversation. I know Tori's going to read a bunch of questions that you've submitted on the chat. And again, I would just say, if you do have a question or a comment, please put it in the chat box. We'll try to get to as many as we can. And Tori.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction and summary, Brian. So again, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box. But while we're waiting for that, why don't we start off with a couple of the submitted ones. So first, kind of looping back to what you talked about at the beginning, someone was wondering, how has COVID-19 impacted current legislative priorities, and what are you guys doing to mitigate the situation?
Well, it's on the legislative priority side in DC especially, it's really been all COVID all the time for the last few months. But our opponents especially have seen any COVID bill as a chance to promote their own ideological agendas. So they've been holding up and stalling passage of several of the COVID bills by trying to attach new abortion restrictions, for example. So this seems likely it's going to be going on for a while. That just last week they passed their fourth version of their fourth COVID response bill. I know the House will be coming back, I think, next week for a couple of days, and they're probably going to take up more of this. We were pretty disappointed that in the last package, there was no funding at all for the global response to this, especially given the Trump administration's efforts to pull the US completely out of the World Health Organization at this point, which is frankly the leading agency around the world that's working to help address this. I know just an example of how this has been going. We've read all these stories about how, the Trump administration just basically pulled all the funding for the US pandemic response. They shut down CDC's international pandemic team. Ironically, there were US government health officials in Wuhan, China before this all started, and just months before the Trump administration shut them down. World Health Organization offered the United States millions of COVID-19 tests that they had developed when this first broke out. He rejected them. The assault against global health has been going on since the first days of this administration, and it started with reproductive health when he imposed the Global Gag Rule on just his first business day in office. and then proposed a complete elimination of all reproductive health and family planning funding in his first budget proposal. It's been so, this has been going, this is not a new thing. But we really do need our champions, especially in the House, to step up and really bring back the focus to the global side of this and the need for greater investment in global health, and especially in family planning and reproductive health programs. And we hope that in the next round of COVID response bills, we can get that to happen. There's a pretty broad coalition working on this, and we're hopeful that we'll get something. We'll get somebody to get this into a package soon enough, and then I don't know what will happen when it gets to the White House.
Great, thank you for that. So kind of following up along the same lines, what are Population Connection Action Fund's top legislative priorities?
Our top legislative priorities at this point are, one, get a market increase in the investment our country makes in global reproductive health and family planning to about $1.6 billion annually. We're at about 600 million now, but if we really want to meet all the unmet need that's out there, the United States is going to have to step up and be a leader and leverage that support to bring other developed countries to increase their own contributions to these programs, and frankly to get the developing countries themselves to make this a higher priority. Second, to restore the U.S. contribution to the United Nations Population Fund. Another thing that Trump did early in his first days in office was withdraw all our support to that agency. Third is to repeal forever the Global Gag Rule by passing the Global Health Empowerment and Rights Act, which would make it impossible for a future president to act unilaterally to reimpose this policy, which has been a disaster every time it's been imposed. And there is tons of evidence about the harm it causes. And that evidence has been clear for a long time, and the supporters of the policy simply choose to ignore it. And fourth is to eliminate and to repeal the Helms Amendment, which is a law passed in 1973 as a backlash to the Roe versus Wade decision, which prohibits US foreign assistance funds from being used to help anyone access safe legal abortion in any of the programs we're serving. And it's been, it also does enormous damage and puts the United States on the side of some pretty egregious situation, against helping people that are facing some pretty egregious situations. There's something like 30,000, more than 30,000 girls and women who die as a result of unsafe abortion every year. It's a major public health crisis in much of the developing world, and US policies like the Helms Amendment and the Global Gag Rule are making that problem worse instead of helping to solve it. So those are our four big priorities going into 2021.
Great, thank you. Next up, could you talk briefly about the benefits of international family planning programs and why US funding is so important?
Yeah, well, we talk about that all the time, but I'll just give an example. We have one of the things we say is like, what does this, we often refer to these as an investment in a better world. I mean, what it gets us is stability, security, and survival. Resource security, peace and stability, and survival. It's one of the most important investments we can make. And I'll just give you a couple of facts about what we get out of this. For every $10 million that we invest in international family planning programs, we can get more than 400,000 women and couples getting access to contraceptives, 124,000 fewer unintended pregnancies, 53,000 fewer induced abortions, most of which would be provided in unsafe conditions, 54,000 fewer unplanned births and 240 fewer maternal deaths. That's just a small part of what we get, but we also get like an improved world situation. It's really no coincidence that some of the most unstable places in the world are the places where women have the least autonomy and the least control over their own reproductive futures. There's been a lot of talk in Congress among some of our champions just over the past couple of years about something called a youth bulge, where a lot of these countries have really large populations of young people without employment, without real access to education. People like Barbara Lee and Ami Bera and Chrissy Houlihan have been talking about this and what's this doing in leading to situations around the world that we don't really want to see. So investing in these programs has a long history of bringing about really important improvements in people's lives.
Great, thank you. So how exactly can we continue to advocate for international family planning during a presidential election and with the distraction of a pandemic? How do we keep the momentum going?
Well, I think there's still a lot of opportunities for activism and engagement with elected officials, with candidates. They're looking for ways to connect with their constituents and their voters. They do a lot of elected officials are doing online town halls. You can go to a town hall meeting and without ever leaving your house now. You can join our Fight for Her. You can sign up. We can get you alerts to what's happening in Congress on any given week. We can get you, give you ways to contact, give you things to talk about. Work with candidates too. I think, that's one of the things we've found is that like engaging with candidates has been really, really important for moving this issue forward. And that's both with presidential candidates. The first presidential election our organization was really worked in was in 2016. And we got both, and we started during the primaries, we got both Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders to weigh in on both the Global Gag Rule and on the Helms Amendment, and in focusing on the global reproductive health needs in the world. And we've been doing the same this year. Our organizers and our volunteers, especially in New Hampshire and Nevada, which were early primary and caucus states, were showing up at candidate forums and town halls and debates and really trying to make sure this was part of the conversation. And we're going to continue to do that over the next several months to get candidates on the record, both at the congressional level, but also we've been increasing our outreach to the Biden campaign and trying to get some personal conversations there and get some real commitments from the candidate on these issues. And I think there's a chance for all of you in your own communities and your own states to weigh in on these as well.
Great. So a specific follow-up to that, someone just asked, have we been in touch with the Biden campaign? And if so, is there anything volunteers can do to help?
I think volunteers can always be helpful with candidates. The more that a candidate, including presidential candidates, hear these kinds of questions or are asked about these issues, or if he's doing, if Joe Biden is doing a forum in your state, and sign up, join in, try to get a question in, get him talking about it. And that's pretty much what our organizers and volunteers were doing when candidates were still doing in-person events, was showing up and trying to make sure this issue got addressed. It's hard to, I think we're all in a new world about campaigns now and trying to figure out what the best ways to influence those candidates are. I really want to we're really trying to figure that out, and I think the candidates are too. But they're certainly going to be doing digital events and trying to make sure you get into those and get these questions asked is always going to be helpful. I know, for example, we just heard from our organizer in New Hampshire that there are several congressional candidates doing online or Zoom forums in the coming weeks, and letting us know that they're going to be trying to get in there and make sure these questions, they're asked about these issues.
Great. So can you explain in more detail the grassroots work that we've been doing in specific target states and how that makes a difference?
So there's so much grassroots work we're doing. It's sort of hard to know where to start, but I'll just I'll give some examples. So just because this is most recent. So in this Sacramento area where we have an organizer in Congressman Ami Bera's district. She's been organizing people in that district and I think we started that last fall. That's when we first started in that district. She's been organizing people there since last fall, showing up at town halls that Congressman Bera was at, making sure he knew we were grateful and that they were grateful for his leadership on these issues on the House Foreign Affairs Committee and in the House. Got him to film a short video that he shared on his own social media about his commitment to these kinds of to global reproductive health programs, to repealing the Global Gag Rule. Last night he joined our volunteer call to talk about the work he's doing and the importance of grassroots involvement, and how it's engaged him in a way that he was always a supporter, but now he's much more out front on it in his district and in DC. And similar things are happening in Arizona with Congressman Ann Kirkpatrick from Tucson and Ruben Gallego from Phoenix, where they have been working with our organizers and volunteers for a few years now. Actually, Ann Kirkpatrick wore one of our T-shirts in an ad she ran in 2018. So we counted that as a huge win. So that's happening, and I mentioned what's happening in Pennsylvania with Congresswoman Susan Wild from the Lehigh Valley, who's also on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and we've built a solid relationship with her through the grassroots work that's happening in her district. And it's both showing up at town meetings and asking these questions, but it's also that our organizers and volunteers jumped in and were active in her campaign in 2018, knocking on doors and making phone calls, showing up for campaign events, making sure, I think over the course between all of our people, we made thousands of voter contacts in 2018 and more thousands of phone calls to voters. It really matters, and they recognize it, and they know now that not only is it good policy, which they've always understood, but it's also really good politics, that there's a base of support in their communities for these programs, and it makes them far more likely to be out front, to be leaders, to be outspoken. And they don't think about it as taking a risk. They think about it as speaking out on issues of concern for their constituents. And that's an important place to be.
Definitely. Okay, so kind of looking forward now, what do you think the future of U.S. international family funding will look like?
I'm an optimist. I think I think come the November of 2020, there's a chance for some pretty significant changes with a new Senate and hopefully a new president who have made commitments to invest in these programs, to support policies that will make the funding work better as opposed to hamstringing, that will support the people doing such crucial work around the world, and that will start to make sure to address the unmet need that's out there. There's at least 214 million people who want to prevent or delay pregnancy around the world, but have an unmet need for contraceptives. and getting those people getting people into office who understand that, who recognize it, who want to make progress is going to be the key to starting to make that progress. So I'm hopeful, but I don't think much will happen until then, because we have a Senate leadership and a White House which is largely immune to facts and information and expertise. And we see that with COVID. We've seen that with reproductive health and family planning. These are, that they have always elevated ideology and base politics over expertise and science. And that's, I don't have much hope that's going to change in the next few months. So we have to change them. Ralph Northam, the governor of Virginia, who was, when he was running in 2017, used to say, we're going to try to change their minds, and if we can't, we got to change their seats. So I think that's where we are. We got to change their seats.
Okay,
we got to get a Senate leadership that's going to stand with us and not against us.
That leads perfectly into our last question, which is, what are your general thoughts on the 2020 election? I know you mentioned how we're working with the Biden campaign, but especially the chances of taking back the Senate and passing some of this legislation that we feel is so important.
I think the 2020 election offers enormous opportunities. It's a great, it's a great I hate to make election predictions now because I was so wrong 4 years ago. But the trends are really strong. I mean, I just saw information. There's new polling from Georgia where Democratic candidates are leading in both Senate races that are happening there this year. And Biden is leading Trump in Georgia. The president's approval ratings in places like Texas are deep underwater. There's a Senate race in Texas. There's a Senate race in Kansas, which might be in play depending on who the Republican nominee is. I think there's a chance for a pretty sweeping landslide. I wouldn't predict that now, but there's a lot happening out there. People are getting pretty deeply disappointed and deeply concerned about what's the direction of the country. And we're looking to a number of places that we think are up for grabs. I'll talk about a couple of specific candidates here. For a long time, Susan Collins in Maine was like a voice of reason and moderation and was a supporter of these programs in the Senate. Under the Trump era, she's been voting for his appointees who are dismantling every program she voted to support. People like Andrew Bremberg to be our UN ambassador in Geneva, whose entire agenda is about stripping reproductive health access out of every global agreement that exists, who takes pride in believing that abortion should be illegal for everyone under every circumstance. This is the agenda she voted to promote in international organizations. So, in the past, we would have not gotten involved in the Maine Senate race, but this year, all she's done has undermined everything she has done in the past. So we've endorsed Sarah Gideon in the Senate race in Maine. And, that looks like a really positive chance to flip a Senate seat. There's a number of places in Arizona or in other states, like in Arizona, where Mark Kelly is running against Martha McSally. Martha McSally, who lost the Senate election in 2018 to Kyrsten Sinema and then was appointed to another seat. That doesn't really sit well with many people. You shouldn't lose an election and get the job anyway. But Mark Kelly is well ahead of her in polling and fundraising and every other metric out there. In North Carolina, another one of our target states, Tom Tillis is up for re-election. He's in deep trouble. I mentioned Georgia. In Iowa, we endorsed Teresa Greenfield in the Senate race there. She's running to challenge Joni Ernst, and is running incredibly strong. So I think there's a real and growing chance of taking back of Democrats and supporters of reproductive health and family planning taking back the Senate in 2018.
Great news. Okay.
Assuming we have fair elections. It's a big assumption, but if elections are generally fair and if people have access to voting, I think it's going to be really hard for a lot of these candidates to hold on.
Okay, so just a brief follow-up and clarifying question. Going back to the main race, someone asked that they had noticed that Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, both Republican senators, did sign on to the HER Act, and they asked if that means that they should support retention. You touched on that, but if you want to.
I did. Well, I will say we don't, and we don't think you should either, because what she's done. I mean, you know, she's signed on to the bill, but voted for appointees who are dismantling all the infrastructure necessary to provide the care she says she supports, both at the agency level, but also among, you know, on the domestic issues. Also, the judges she's been supporting have been pretty committed to undoing all of these things. So yeah, I hope I answered that more thoroughly in the first time I said it, but just to reiterate.
That was perfect. Well, thank you so much, Brian. That was great. We really appreciate you talking with us today. And thank you everyone for joining us, especially for those of you all over the country. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your day. And again, if you have any additional questions that we did not get to, please feel free to email us at engage@popconnect.com. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all. Appreciate your time, and hope I covered everything you cared about. And if I didn't, I apologize. We didn't get to everything. But yeah, get back in touch and we'll respond.